The Strait of Gibraltar emerged on the horizon like an ancient scar carved between continents, a passage through which peoples, empires, myths, and wars had flowed for millennia. For the men aboard the Victoria, however, it represented something far more personal, the threshold between death and salvation. Once they crossed it, Europe would no longer be a distant memory. It would be real, tangible, attainable. But the approach was anything but simple. The winds shifted unpredictably, drawn into violent funnels by the towering cliffs. The currents pulled in conflicting directions, as if the sea itself wished to impede the final stretch of their journey. Even the sunlight, reflected against the rocky faces of the strait, seemed sharper and hotter, piercing their tired eyes. Juan Sebastian Elcano felt the tension of the moment settle into his bones. Everything the crew had endured, storms, hunger, thirst, battles, despair, had led them to this point. One mistake now, one miscalculation, one spur of bad luck, and the Victoria might not complete the final chapter of its impossible Odyssey. The men, weakened and gaunt, stood at their posts with trembling legs. Their clothes hung in tatters, their hair long and matted, their beards uneven, their skin darkened by sun and salt. Their hands, cracked and bleeding, clung to ropes and beams out of instinct rather than strength. But behind the exhaustion in their eyes burned something harder to extinguish. The certainty that they were close, so close to home. As the Victoria advanced, small fishing boats began to dot the waters of the strait. The sailors watched the foreign vessels carefully. After years of danger and pursuit, trust was not something they offered freely. But soon the fishermen approached, curiosity overcoming fear. They shouted in languages familiar once again: Spanish, Basque, Catalan, Portuguese. Their faces reflected shock, confusion, disbelief. What was this ghost ship approaching from the south? What were these skeletal figures aboard her? Some fishermen crossed themselves upon seeing the victorious state. Others yelled questions. A few simply stared in silence, as if witnessing an apparition. Word spread quickly. Before the Victoria had even crossed into the calmer waters beyond the strait, the coastline was already alive with speculation. Messengers raced inland, smoke signals rose. By the time the ship entered the Bay of Cadiz, people rushed to the shore in growing crowds, their expressions a mixture of awe and horror. But the Victoria did not stop. Her destination was clear Sanlúcar de Barrameda, the place where the dream had begun. Her sails, patched and torn, caught the wind with the last vestiges of strength. She moved slowly but resolutely along the familiar route up the Guadalquivir River. Each curve brought back memories for the crew, not conscious memories but visceral ones. Their hearts pounded, their breaths caught in their throats. The riverbanks filled with people, men, women, children, farmers, merchants, monks, all gathered to witness the return of the lost expedition. Some cried, some shouted, some waved cloths, others simply fell to their knees. Never before had anyone seen a ship so battered, so changed, so evidently shaped by the world. The Victoria looked smaller than anyone expected, and that made her survival even more incomprehensible. The bells of Sanlúcar tolled, people ran to the docks, authorities, clergymen, and dignitaries rushed forward as if the ship carried divine revelation. But when the gangplank was lowered and the few surviving crew members stepped onto land, a silence fell over the crowd. 18 men, 18 survivors out of the more than 200 who had departed. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, bodies fragile. Some needed help to walk. Some wept the moment their feet touched solid ground. Others looked around as if unsure whether what they saw was real. Their emaciated silhouettes contrasted brutally with the triumphant murmurs rising among the crowd. Elcano descended last. He carried in his expression a weight that no honor could erase, the weight of responsibility for those who had not returned, and the weight of having achieved something that would echo across centuries. The people approached timidly at first, then with reverence. Some kissed the sailors' hands. Others embraced them. Some brought food and water. Mothers lifted their children to see the heroes. The returning crew members were overwhelmed, caught between joy and the ache of memory, standing on a threshold between life and ghosthood. After a brief rest, the Victoria resumed her journey up river. The ship advanced slowly, almost ceremonially, escorted by small boats filled with curious onlookers. Along the banks, entire villages gathered to witness the miracle of her return. Songs rose, prayers were spoken aloud. The news outran the ship itself. By the time the Victoria approached Seville, the city was ready. The bells rang thunderously. Crowds pressed along the riverbanks, spilling over bridges, squares, and streets. The entire city seemed to tremble with anticipation. Children climbed rooftops, merchants left their shops, noblemen and clerics lined the docks. When the Victoria finally appeared, small and scarred, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. She moved gently, her reflection shimmering on the water as if the river itself honored her. This was not merely a ship. It was a relic, a witness, a survivor, a symbol of something far greater than any individual aboard her. As she docked, the roar of thousands erupted. Cheers, applause, tears, people shouting the sailors' names, crying out for Magellan, chanting prayers of gratitude. Families rushed forward, searching for familiar faces. Some found them, many did not. Women fainted, men embraced strangers. Children stared in awe at the ragged sailors who looked more like saints painted on church walls than living men. The survivors stepped onto the pier one by one, trembling, overwhelmed. Clerics sprinkled holy water over them. Officials moved forward to record names. Doctors examined the men. Bread, water, and wine were offered in abundance. But nothing, not the cheers nor the honors, compared to the emotional collapse many sailors experienced. They cried with deep primal sobs. They laughed uncontrollably. They knelt and kissed the ground. Their bodies carried the visible marks of the world: scars, burns, missing teeth, swollen joints. But inside them pulsed something indescribable. The memory of a planet circled through agony and courage. The Victoria herself remained in the water, surrounded by silent reverence. People touched her hull as if she was sacred. Children pressed their faces to her sides. Sailors recited prayers. Others simply stared, unable to believe that this frail vessel had conquered oceans no one had dared to cross. Meanwhile, Antonio Pigafetta, tireless chronicler and guardian of memory, began organizing his notes with renewed urgency. He understood that what had just occurred was unprecedented, monumental, and fragile. Without his words, without his records, the journey could be twisted, forgotten, distorted. His diary would soon become the most valuable testimony of the first circumnavigation of the Earth. The arrival of the Victoria in Sanlúcar marked a historic moment, but the final journey up the Guadalquivir toward Seville carried a deeper, almost spiritual significance. It was as though the ship, after circumnavigating the world, were returning to the womb of history itself, a homecoming filled with memories, scars, and the weight of an experience no other vessel on Earth had endured. The passage up the river was slow, almost ceremonial. The tide dictated the rhythm, carrying the Victoria gently through calm waters that shimmered in the afternoon light. The breeze sliding over the river was soft, touching the ship's salt-bitten timbers as if comforting her after years of torment. The sounds of land, birds, rustling leaves, distant voices of workers along the riverbank felt unreal. After years hearing only storms, gales, and the crashing of waves, these earthly noises were a balm. The men aboard had to relearn how to listen. At every bend in the river, small boats approached to catch sight of the legendary ship. Fishermen, merchants, peasants, entire families rowed close, marveling at the sight. Rumors had already spread like wildfire. This was the ship that had sailed around the entire world. Some made the sign of the cross. Others removed their hats in reverence. A few simply stared, stunned. The Victoria's surviving crew, barely more than a handful, watched in silence. They were thin, weak, pale in places and dark in others from infection and sunburn. Yet their eyes carried something incomparable, the weight of an experience no other living soul on Earth had endured. They had seen everything, extremes of life and death, courage and cruelty, beauty and terror. As the ship entered Seville, the city erupted. People flooded the riverbanks. Church bells rang furiously. Authorities, merchants, nobles rushed to the port. Families who had waited years for news of loved ones ran toward the river, torn between hope and dread. The atmosphere was a collision of joy and grief. The sun illuminated the Victoria in a way that felt symbolic. Every patch, every scar, every splintered board became visible. The ship looked smaller than anyone expected, almost fragile, which only deepened the astonishment at her achievement. How could something so modest have conquered oceans so vast? When she docked, the moment felt ritualistic. Bells rang again across the city. The survivors were welcomed like ghosts returned from the dead. Tears flowed freely. Mothers fainted. Fathers embraced strangers. Children hid behind skirts, peeking at the gaunt, weathered figures who had sailed beyond the limits of imagination. Juan Sebastian Elcano remained upright, but vulnerability flickered behind his eyes. He knew that the most challenging chapter still awaited, recounting the journey. Not the storms, the hunger, the battles, but the meaning of it all. For he would soon stand before Emperor Charles I to tell the story of the voyage that had changed the world. In the following days, while the sailors slowly recovered, Seville became a stage of rumors, celebrations, and debates. Stories circulated like currency: the death of Magellan, the discovery of the Strait, the Pacific crossing, the rebellion crushed in Patagonia. The battles in the Philippines, the escape from Portuguese territories, the storm at the Cape. The scent of cloves and spices filled the streets near the port, perfuming the air with a sweetness so powerful it felt unreal, a reminder of the worldly motivation that had triggered this entire endeavor. While the city reacted with awe, the royal court prepared to receive His journey to Valladolid was marked by honors, feasts, and celebrations. But beneath the praise lay an undercurrent of political complexity. The empire wanted details. The expedition had succeeded, yet at immense human cost. 4 out of 5 ships had disappeared. Hundreds of men had died. And Magellan, the architect of the dream, would never return. When Elcano finally stood before the emperor, his report lasted hours. He described storms, starvation, alliances, deaths, discoveries, betrayals, and moments of near-divine fortune. Charles, I listened with intensity, understanding that the world had just changed politically, economically, and philosophically. In recognition, he granted Elcano a coat of arms with the inscription Primus circumnavigate me, you are the first to circumnavigate me, a symbol not only of honor, but of legacy. While Elcano became a national hero, the Victoria faced a different fate. Experts, shipwrights, carpenters, navigators examined her with reverence. They touched her timbers as if studying the anatomy of a miracle. Their conclusion was unanimous. Her survival defied explanation. But the Victoria would never sail again. Time had consumed her strength. She would remain in the port, not as a ship of the future, but as a memory, a monument made of scars. And yet, even as the wood began to deteriorate, something extraordinary was happening. People came from far and near to see her. She became a pilgrimage site. Sailors whispered prayers near her hull. Poets wrote verses, philosophers contemplated her significance. Children touched her sides with wonder. Her physical decay did not weaken her power, it strengthened her myth. While the Victoria rested in silent dignity, Antonio Pigafetta worked tirelessly. His diary, meticulous, emotional, precise, became the bridge between the lived experience and the future. He rewrote passages, expanded descriptions, organized maps, and annotated details. He understood that without his words, the journey would dissolve into rumor. With them, it would become history. Beyond the port, life resumed for the survivors. Some returned to their families. Others wandered the city in a daze, unable to adapt to stillness after years of motion. The beds felt too soft, the food too rich, the silence too deep. Many woke at night hearing phantom waves, their minds still at sea. For the people of Seville, the Victoria became more than a ship. She became a vessel of meaning. Her story reshaped the imagination of Europe. Maps were redrawn. Debates erupted in universities. New expeditions were planned. The world, once a distant labyrinth, now felt connected. Globalization, though the word did not yet exist, had begun. Trade routes expanded. Cultures intertwined. Empires grew restless. The idea that the Earth was one interconnected sphere transformed the thinking of an entire civilization. And at the heart of this transformation stood a ship slowly dissolving into the river air. With the passing months, her wood weakened. Salt, sun, and time devoured her. Sections were removed. Some pieces were preserved in churches, others in noble households. Some were fashioned into crosses, relics of divine providence. Pieces of the Victoria spread across the world, physically and symbolically. Artists rushed to document her before she vanished completely. Drawings, sketches, and early engravings captured her silhouette. These images would later guide future reconstructions, allowing generations yet unborn to glimpse the form of the vessel that had changed the world. The survivors continued their quiet lives. For some, the sea called again. Others avoided it entirely. Many carried within themselves an unhealed wound, the knowledge that the world was too vast, too beautiful, and too cruel to ever forget. But the story had already escaped them. It belonged now to everyone. In taverns, churches, and markets, people retold the tale with embellishments. The Victoria grew in size. Magellan became a mythic hero. The storms became battles with supernatural forces. Truth blended with imagination, creating legend. But beneath the myth lay something real. The undeniable, unalterable fact that a small ship had circled the world. Even as the Victoria's planks crumbled, her soul grew. Her memory sailed across time, not on water, but on words, drawings, and hearts. A miracle of wood had become a miracle of history, and her journey, far from ending, had only just begun. The story of the Victoria spread across Europe like wildfire, leaping from rooftop to rooftop. It wasn't merely news, it was revelation. Cartographers redrew their maps. Chroniclers wrote treatises. Navigators gathered in taverns to dissect every segment of the route. The idea that the world could be circled was no longer a theory or a dream, it was a fact. And that fact came not from a massive warship or an imperial marvel, but from a modest, battered vessel that had somehow survived the unimaginable. The expedition's impact grew with each passing week. Monarchs, scholars, merchants all debated what the journey meant. The world, once imagined as a fragmented mosaic of islands and continents separated by endless waters, now appeared interconnected. A single ocean touched all shores. A single voyage had stitched the planet together. Humanity would never look at Earth the same way again. But while intellectual circles buzzed with analysis, life in Seville moved at a more intimate, emotional pace. The survivors of the Victoria, still frail, tried to return to ordinary life, though nothing about life felt ordinary anymore. The familiar sounds of the city felt too loud or too soft, the smells too intense, the faces too new. Years of navigating terror and hunger had reshaped their senses. Some sailors walked with canes, their bodies permanently weakened. Others moved with haunted expression, as though still listening for the roar of waves or the crack of storm-whipped sails. Citizens greeted them everywhere they went, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with fear. Too many, the survivors looked like men returned from the underworld. Nighttime was the most difficult. Silence brought memories that daylight could distract. Some awoke trembling, recalling storms that nearly split the ship in two. Others dreamt of the immense, silent Pacific. Many cried without understanding why. And some, unable to sleep at all, wandered the streets until dawn. Meanwhile, Antonio Pigafetta worked tirelessly on what would become the most important chronicle of the journey. Scholars flocked to him, his notebooks filled with descriptions of landscapes, flora, fauna, languages, rituals, storms, hunger, wonders and horrors were more than a journal. They were a new map of the world. A map not of geography alone, but of human experience. Elcano, on the other hand, faced the political aftermath. Honors were followed by expectations, invitations, demands. He attended councils, banquets, negotiations. Everyone wanted him: the crown, foreign ambassadors, merchants, naval strategists. He felt admiration, certainly, but he also felt something no one else could see: the unbearable weight of memory. Because while others celebrated the circumnavigation, only he knew its true cost. Every applause reminded him of the dead. Every feast contrasted with the hunger that had nearly killed them. Every honor echoed with the names of those swallowed by the sea. Late at night, Elcano walked alone along the banks of the Guadalquivir. He listened to the quiet lap of water and felt the presence of the oceans he had crossed. He thought of Magellan, of his ambition, brilliance and pride. He thought of the storms that battered them near the Cape. He thought of the islands where friends had died. He thought of the faces of men he would never see again. He thought, above all, about the nature of Earth itself. They had circled it. They had proven it was round, not through theory, but through blood and salt. And this realization carried a beauty and terror unlike anything he had ever felt. Beyond political ripples, the voyage unleashed waves across the world. Delegations from France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and beyond came to interview the survivors. Scholars filled notebooks with their testimonies. Merchants recalculated trade routes. Priests interpreted the feat as divine signal. Rival kingdoms plotted. But in the taverns and markets of Seville, the story became legend. The Victoria grew larger in each retelling. Storms became supernatural. Encounters with locals became epics. Magellan transformed into a mythic figure, half man, half symbol. Songs were composed, poems written, sermons preached. Yet beneath exaggeration lay a core of truth. A fragile vessel with a dying crew had circled the earth. The Victoria herself became a monument. Visitors traveled from distant regions to see her. Old sailors approached with hats removed, whispering prayers. Children traced her battered hull with curious fingers. Artists sketched every angle. Architects studied her shape to understand how something so humble had survived the edges of the world. But time, relentless and impartial, began to erode her. Salt ate into her timbers, sun bleached her sides, rain softened her beams. Shipwrights who examined her understood that although she looked whole, she was hollowing from within. Some suggested preserving her by rebuilding parts. Others argued doing so would erase her authenticity. A few believed decay was sacred, a natural end for a creature that had lived beyond all natural limits. Regardless of opinion, one truth remained. The world wanted to remember her. Pieces of her were removed for preservation. Some became religious relics, crosses, amulets, symbols of salvation. Others entered private collections. A few were kept untouched, sealed away like precious bones. In a way, the Victoria dispersed into the world, just as her story had. Fragment by fragment, memory by memory. She became legend even before she physically disappeared. The survivors continued to rebuild their lives. Some married, others returned to the sea despite vows never to do so. A few traveled, telling their story to anyone willing to listen. Many, however, grew quiet, as though part of them had remained in the Pacific or the Strait or the Indian Ocean. Because after circling the world, how could anyone remain the same? And in that question lay the deeper meaning of the Victoria's voyage. For the people of Seville, the ship represented more than exploration. She represented the transformation of human consciousness. The idea that the earth was finite yet boundless, terrifying yet navigable, enormous yet unified. The discovery that the world did not end at the horizon but continued endlessly, embracing itself in a circle. Empires would rise and fall because of that realization. Trade routes would shift. Diplomacy and warfare would acquire global dimensions. Cultures would mix. Knowledge would spread across continents. The modern world would begin quietly, invisibly, from the moment the Victoria dropped anchor in Seville. It was a moment that marked the end of one age and the birth of another. As years passed, the physical ship faded, but her story grew stronger. It was taught, debated, celebrated. Engravings of her circulated through Europe. Pigafetta's manuscript, eventually copied and translated, spread her tale further still. Philosophers quoted it. Scientists used it as evidence. Poets as inspiration. The Victoria had become eternal. Her journey did not end the day she reached Seville. It continued in each retelling, each reinterpretation, each generation that sought meaning in the courage, suffering, and resilience of the men who sailed her. For the Victoria had done something extraordinary, not just circumnavigated the globe, but expanded the mental boundaries of humanity. She revealed the size of the world. She revealed the fragility of life. She revealed the strength of human will. She revealed the connection between all peoples and all oceans. And long after her wood rotted away, her essence remained afloat, a ship made not of timber, but of memory. The Victoria sailed on, not across water, but across time, across imagination, across history, across the hearts of those who dared to dream beyond the horizon. As the years passed, the story of the Victoria shifted from news to legacy. Time, with its selective grace, began polishing certain details and burying others. What had begun as a commercial and geopolitical enterprise gradually transformed into a chapter of human transcendence, an act of daring that surpassed the practical motivations of its own era. Across Spain, the memory of the voyage appeared in official maps, scholarly texts, religious sermons, and poetic verses. The journey became proof of imperial glory, of naval progress, of Iberian courage. Yet, hidden beneath those polished narratives, echoed quieter stories, the sacrifices of anonymous sailors, the storms that nearly ended everything, the hunger that hollowed bodies, the mutinies, the grief, the victories paid in blood, and at the heart of it all, the humble ship that had endured the impossible. The Victoria, already considerably weakened, acquired an almost spiritual aura. Pieces of her timber were treated like relics, some stored in noble houses, others carved into religious objects, others preserved in chests like sacred fragments of the world's edge. In each sliver of wood lingered whispers of the Pacific silence, the Indian Ocean's fury, the Patagonian winds, and the treacherous tempests near the Cape of Good Hope. Around the docks of Seville, visitors from near and far came to see what remained of her. Craftsmen touched her beams as though consulting ancient scripture. Young apprentices climbed aboard to feel the rough grain of her timbers. Writers, inspired, attempted to capture her spirit. Old sailors approached her with bowed heads. With time, however, deterioration became inevitable. Salt, sun, and years of strain had weakened her structure. Some planks loosened, others cracked. Portions of the deck began to collapse. Though shipwrights tried to stabilize her, they knew there was no way to restore her without erasing the very scars that defined her. Her disintegration was slow, natural, and strangely poetic. Many mourned the fading of the physical ship. Others argued that her decay only amplified her legend. A vessel that had traveled around the world did not deserve to rot in obscurity. She deserved to return to the elements she had conquered. Eventually, the Victoria ceased to exist as a functional ship, but she became something more profound. She became memory. She became symbol. She became myth. Her shape survived in drawings, engravings, and miniature models crafted with reverence. These artistic records would allow future generations, centuries later, to recreate her form in museums and replicas. The original ship faded, but her presence multiplied. Meanwhile, the survivors forged their paths. Some immersed themselves in quiet domestic life. Others returned to the sea, unable to escape the call of waves. A few became storytellers in taverns, recounting their Odyssey to sailors who never tired of hearing it. Their bodies aged, but their eyes retained the distant glow of men who had witnessed too much. Juan Sebastian Elcano's life took a bittersweet direction. After the celebrations and honors, he accepted new responsibilities from the crown. He was asked to advise expeditions, inspect fleets, and even command new voyages. But the shadows of the past followed him. The circumnavigation had carved deep marks into his soul, marks that would never fully heal, and in a twist of fate both poetic and tragic, he would die at sea years later, commanding another expedition. His destiny, inseparable from the ocean, had always been written in the tides. As for Pigafetta, he dedicated himself feverishly to his manuscript. He revisited every note, every drawing, every measurement. His diary became more than a narrative. It became a monument, a bridge between the ephemeral experience of the voyage and the permanence of written memory. His work ensured that the Victoria's journey would never dissolve into rumor. His words carried the ship across centuries. The expedition's impact expanded as the decades passed. It reshaped global trade, accelerated the formation of empires, inspired scientists, challenged philosophers, and provoked theological debates. The world, once immense and unknowable, became something that could be circled with persistence, ingenuity, and courage. The circumnavigation marked the beginning of a new era, not a sudden transformation but a subtle shift in the collective consciousness of humankind. Because once the Victoria proved that the Earth could be traversed completely, the idea of impossible began to change. Distances shrank, horizons widened, cultures encountered one another. Earth became one. Centuries later, historians would point to the Victoria as the symbolic spark of globalization the moment humanity realized it inhabited a single interconnected sphere. But for the residents of Seville, for the sailors who returned, for the families who waited, for the scholars who documented, for the children who touched the ship's battered hull, the Victoria meant something even more intimate. She was proof that fragility and greatness often coexist, proof that determination can reshape destiny, proof that the world is vast, but not unreachable, proof that even the smallest vessel can carry the largest dream. Her wood may have faded, her sails may have turned to dust, her masts may have fallen, but the Victoria had already transcended her material form. She lived in words, drawings, and stories. She lived in memory. She lived in every heart moved by her journey. And so, long after her physical body returned to the Earth, the Victoria continued to sail, not on waves, but through time, across generations, across continents, across imaginations. Because while humans live, dream, explore, and search for what lies beyond the horizon, the Victoria will never stop navigating. Her voyage was not a circle drawn once around the world. It was a circle drawn forever within humanity, an eternal circumnavigation, a journey that continues,